Hi, folks. Today we're talking about African Americans in cities. As we begin, we need to clarify, elucidate, and discuss a few themes concerning this chapter. And ultimately, when we're talking about African Americans in cities, we're talking ultimately about African American neighborhoods. And Black neighborhoods are a deliberate social phenomenon that they are not in existence and were not established simply by accident or happenstance, that these neighborhoods are a result of willful policies and practices that are still with us to some extent to this day. And they've generally been in existence for roughly the past 100 years, going back to the early 1920s, is when generally the patterns and the stability, if you will, with respect to the treatment of African Americans in cities coalesced around unique neighborhoods, separating them from whites and members of other groups. We also have to talk about migration as a significant aspect of the growth and development of African American neighborhoods, particularly in terms of Black neighborhoods in northern cities. And so we're talking really ultimately about the Great Migration and the push and pull factors that led to the Great Migration that sustained it over time, over several decades. And we'll be talking more about ultimately what Black neighborhoods represent, that segregation is clearly an entrenched reality and pattern, if you will, with respect to the existence of Black neighborhoods, that there are certainly indeed cultural matters to consider, and you'll be looking at that this week with the discussion and the documentary concerning Detroit's Black Bottom community and Paradise Valley. So indeed, cultural aspects are certainly ingrained and embedded in inherently in African American neighborhoods. However, those cultural benefits, again, do exist in a context, a social context of deliberate policy and practice that have, again, sustained and created segregation and concentration effects related to segregation for African Americans in cities. And so we'll go ahead and get into the nitty gritty, so to speak, right here and there. So generally, again, African American neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, largely, especially within northern cities, are a recent phenomenon with respect to even the short history of our United States. So really, again, going back into the early 1920s is where we would see policies and procedures that ultimately were there to undergird and to buttress and to ultimately keep blacks in place in northern cities. And so this happened quite a bit all over. So we're looking at cities from New York City to Philadelphia to Chicago to Detroit and so on and so forth. Prior to the 1920s, blacks in urban America were not particularly segregated. The vast majority of the nation's black population was still rural and primarily southern. And generally speaking, blacks, especially those African Americans who were living in northern cities, prior to 1920 were much more likely to be living integrated lives. And in many cases, they were far less segregated than a lot of working class whites and ethnic whites as well. However, the Great Migration begins in earnest during the late 19 teens. So we're looking at push and pull factors ultimately sustaining and creating the Great Migration to northern cities from the rural South. So you had unstable economic and market forces in the rural southern agricultural economy, the boll weevil infestation, making, if you will, gains or some kind of wage period, very unreliable and very unstable, in addition to, of course, the virulent racist practices that were pervasive in this part of the country during this time. So those were push factors out of the South. Pull factors up to the North included wages that were significantly, and in some cases hand over fist, more than what African Americans would get in their prior Southern enclaves. And so being able to come to Detroit and Metro Detroit and work with respect to work within the auto industry for, say, for instance, a company like Ford, where you could make $5 a day at the time. That was truly a paradigm shift. And newspapers and communications media at the time regularly communicated about this in mass to African American populations through black newspapers, like, say, for instance, the Chicago Defender. So this was one of the best ways to ultimately mobilize effectively black populations to move from their rural southern, if you will, environs and take a chance on cities like Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, and so forth. And so the economics really made this much more palatable. And when we're looking at, again, this point in history during the 19 teens, we're looking at the history of World War One, and we're looking at the pull of white soldiers into that conflict and what that did to workplaces. That they were, in many cases, particularly in rather unskilled labor and semi-skilled labor operations, there were just enormous needs for those white workers to be replaced, and so African Americans became ultimately, in a sense, the replacement workforce for the whites who had gone to fight per in World War One. So as the black populations swell immensely during this time in places like Flint, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, this is where we start to see restrictive practices and zoning practices and approaches that were violent as well in nature that would ultimately keep blacks hemmed in place in a key area or a select few areas of a particular city. And so a lot of what these areas would be called or known as, they were often called or referred to as black belts, very, very sort of restricted districts, so to speak. And so Paradise Valley, Black Bottom was an example of an enclave that was ethnic, that blacks ultimately, through invasion succession, were able to get in, if you will, after the moving on, succeeding, if you will, working class white ethnics. They were able to move into Black Bottom and Paradise Valley and succeed the prior white populations that lived there in a sort of significant, typical way of immigrants moving into an area, and then as they do a bit better economically, they move further on. And so that's ultimately what happened to the whites that moved away from areas like Black Bottom, and then blacks moved in, again continuing that trend, that succession. However, again, when we're looking at zoning practices as well as restrictive covenants that were developed during the 20s and beyond, these kinds of practices evolved many of the enclave aspects of emerging black neighborhoods and turned them ultimately into ghettos that were, again, created and constructed largely to keep blacks in place and to keep them from threatening nervous white populations. So typically, again, blacks would be in major cities, especially in the north, zoned into areas that were virtually all black. And it didn't matter in terms of what social class or what kind of work experience or background that these African Americans had, that you'd have wealthy blacks and poor blacks and working class blacks often living in a lot of respects side by side in the same buildings, apartment buildings, and other kinds of domiciles in the same, if you will, single family home neighborhoods or other kinds of neighborhoods. They would often share physical space. Whites who bought homes at this time, often in the process of purchasing the home, would have to sign an agreement, what we know now today as a restrictive covenant, that would say that they, per their condition of sale, would not sell out ultimately to non-whites, that they could not sell to African Americans, they could not sell to, in many other cases, Jews, Latinos, and Native Americans. And so the idea was that doing so would threaten, if you will, property values and would create and threaten for the creation perhaps of inharmonious racial groups. And so some of that quote comes directly from the Department of Housing and Urban Development's manual about mortgages and about how home, if you will, mortgages could be guaranteed and could be backed by the federal government. And so again, federal policies were also there in addition to local zoning practices that basically said people of color, blacks in particular, are not to be, in a sense, mixed in other kinds of integrated, potentially integrated neighborhoods. And so in addition to covenants, in addition to zoning, in addition to federal regulations, you also had threats and intimidation. So in a lot of cases, African Americans, if they moved on one side of the color line, the wrong side, so to speak, they could be met with threats, intimidation, they could be harassed, they could be bombed, they could be beaten, they could be taunted. You could see mobs often that would come into the area surrounding, in many cases, the house or the housing that the African Americans newly moved into in a predominantly white area. And that is, again, one of the several or many techniques that were used around this time, ultimately to intimidate blacks from moving into predominantly white areas. Right? Also, public housing was developed around this time, especially during the 1930s and 1940s. And although at the beginning public housing had an integrated residential sort of portfolio, and you had often poor and working class whites there along with African Americans in public housing, much like what we saw in the case of white ethnics in areas like Black Bottom, Paradise Valley. They initially would, in a sense, treat the public housing sort of as an enclave. And it was a neighborhood where they got their start, but then the white ethnics and working class whites were able to transition out of public housing communities. And as time went on, especially as racial oriented and racist oriented housing practices became more entrenched, directed towards African Americans, by and large, public housing became exclusively black throughout this country up until relatively recently, so to speak. So, research shows today, and from this point, but certainly into the present day, African American neighborhoods are generally hyper segregated by comparison to mixed immigrant areas, so to speak. Uh, the vast majority of blacks at this time, and often well into the present, depending on which metro area we're talking about, the vast majority of blacks are forced to live in very separate, very unique areas of metro regions, particularly in the northern part of the country. So, very different experiences with respect to, or for comparison, so to speak, when we compare African Americans to, for instance, white ethnics and often those who are white working class. In that those populations, the white ones, again, had much more of an enclave, temporary kind of experience with respect to areas like Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, as well as, again, uh, public housing. And so these became more permanent fixtures and permanent features of cities, but also African American experiences within cities. So, current patterns today. So, if we're thinking about today, we find that segregation between racial groups, particularly in terms of virtually hyper segregated black neighborhoods, that this is an institutionalized pattern. It's built into the structure of how we rent, how we own, our lending practices, and even how we get back and forth to work and what work ultimately we are exposed to and have access to. Regionally, from a regional standpoint, cities of the Midwest are the most segregated, followed by the Northeast, Southeast, and the West. And what a lot has been said about that regional pattern in a lot of respects has to do with the unique labor history that the Midwest has, particularly in terms of unskilled and semi-skilled labor, as well as if you're looking at the industries that concentrated, particularly in the Midwest, such as durable goods manufacturing, automobiles, as well as steel. And so that those industries needing and demanding so many kinds of workers, workers that truly could ultimately run the foundries and run the factories, that required such a large concentration of workers, ultimately African American workers, that is one of the reasons why you find the Midwest cities being so segregated, because they within were met with such African Americans as they came, that is, were met with such virulently racist and segregationist kinds of housing practices. So we do also find segregation to be in a lower degree or of a lower extent in cities where you have fewer African Americans. And so often cities like Sacramento, California are all, in a lot of respects, they are heralded or at least noted for how little segregation that they have in relation to other cities. But again, when you're looking at that segregation, and often it's really measured by what we call an index of dissimilarity today, a sort of segregation index. It's a way of looking at, well, how many whites or how many blacks would have to move within an area or a region to get to or achieve full integration. So these indices, these segregation indexes are very high, again, especially for Midwestern cities. Typically, Milwaukee, Detroit, and Chicago are amongst the most segregated cities in the country during any given point in time. So again, uh, where you had larger numbers and concentrations of African Americans, especially after the 1920s, where again there were large burgeoning needs for semi-skilled and unskilled labor in the industries in these communities. That's often where again you find the greatest, in a sense, legacy today of segregation, hyper-segregation in particular, because this is where those populations were met with the most virulent, most violently enforced practices to keep blacks separate from whites in particular. So even African Americans, I may have mentioned this before, research has shown that even African Americans who are wealthy, who earn well over 200,000 a year, are segregated in ways by race that are not explained, certainly by class, that are not explained by income or not explained simply by where they would prefer to live. Again, we're looking at patterns and practices. One thing that we often see today, especially in the real estate market, is what we call racial steering. Even though it's illegal, it still happens, wherein if someone, a black person, goes to rent or buy a home and goes, say, for instance, to a realtor or goes to some kind of housing agency, often the assumption is made that, well, we should only show this person black areas. And so you're supposed to show people the areas that they are qualified to live in, and that there should not be a sense of, okay, here's where you should be. But nevertheless, we still indeed see that happen. We also still have zoning regulations that effectively zone out certain groups, particularly by income, but often income becomes a proxy, simply rather, for race as well as for class. And so if there's zoning within a town or within neighborhoods that basically disfavors or prevents multifamily housing, that effectively becomes a way that on the surface may seem race blind, but ultimately is a way of being and continuing a racist practice, so to speak. So uh, we have widespread institutional discrimination, widespread practice of this. Research has shown that there are a number of ways within which, during the lending process, that African Americans are discriminated against. We saw this to sadly great effect used in or during the run up to the Great Recession back in the late 2007, 2008 period in particular. A lot of research showed that in many cases, subprime lending was steered toward African American and Latino, if you will, prospective home buyers, even though many of them could have easily fit into a regular conventional loan, and then being steered to those subprime lenders, often brokers in particular, allowed them to be charged unnecessarily high amounts of fees, in addition to often uh, having to be on an adjustable rate mortgage that adjusted in a way that was unaffordable over time. And so those kinds of things have also, research has shown, re-intensified segregation of communities and of races within regions, particularly African Americans and Latinos. All right. Now, suburbanization has also been noted, and you'll see that this week too, in terms of the great article from Bridge Magazine. I really hope that you'll enjoy that and get a good amount out of that. And so, even though in that article notes that African Americans have definitely move to and are indeed in our nation's suburbs. Well over a third of all blacks live in the country suburbs. When it comes down to it, there's a couple of caveats with that. Number one, the pattern does vary by metropolitan area. So in Detroit, metropolitan Detroit is an area where African Americans do live. Hundreds of thousands of blacks do live in Metro Detroit suburbs. And so that is something that has happened over time. And in a lot of respects, there's a lot more suburbanization in and around Detroit compared to a lot of other cities in terms of how much of the region's population lives outside of the major core city. So you do see that Detroit, in some respects, is unique in that respect. At the same time, Milwaukee is an area where you have much more concentration of blacks within the city of Milwaukee itself, in that Milwaukee was or is unique in that African Americans by and large came to Milwaukee much later during the second, if you will, wave of the Great Migration, and that was met with even greater patterns of hostility than what we've seen in most other kinds of cities. But nevertheless, even though African Americans may be in the suburbs, regardless of what metro region we're talking about, often, and this is again consistent with the Bridge Magazine article, often African Americans are still heavily segregated into a few key suburban areas, a few key cities that are in the suburbs. So, in a lot of respects, they may not still have a different opportunity structure from African Americans living in heavily segregated, traditionally urban city neighborhoods. Also, and again, I may have mentioned this before, and so to go back to that, keep in mind, and I point this out in the notes, that blacks moving to the burbs is not necessarily the same as being integrated within the suburbs. And so there's ways within which we have to sort of think about that as well. Well, a person may not live in this part of the city, or they may not live in the city at all, but what does that ultimately mean? Are we empowering African Americans as they move to the suburbs? Again, the research, particularly in terms of wealth inequality, is not showing that to be the case. Regardless of what kind of African American neighborhood we're talking about, and I may have implied this before, African American neighborhoods are much more heterogeneous than white neighborhoods. So there's a great deal. What that means is ultimately there's more diversity in black neighborhoods than you find in a typical white neighborhood. And so you'll have a greater range of income and socioeconomic status backgrounds. So you may find people who are single adults in some neighborhoods. For instance, some black neighborhoods, you may find significant proportions of community members who are single adults. You have others who may be single parents, and then you have others that may be in multi-generational, situations where they're living with, let's say, their parents, and then they have their own dependent children living in the home. So you find more of those situations, more diversity, if you will, of housing and household type in predominantly black areas. And so that does lend itself to a sense of community and a creation of culture that is unique in those neighborhoods as well. But at the same time, that also does, in a lot of respects, posit that the benefits of black neighborhood living are often cultural and not particularly economic. Right? All right. So this is a good sort of segue into, and what we'll talk about next week, into the topics of social class in neighborhoods as well. And much of what we're going to be talking about in that chapter is again going to be very consistent with what we're talking about in terms of African Americans in cities.